He was the most feared Korean mafia boss in the city, and in front of the world, he said he had never met her. Not "we're not together," not "no comment." He erased her completely. But what nobody in that press conference room knew, what nobody watching those cameras knew, was that the woman he just denied was carrying his child. She was already packed, already at the door, already gone, one hand resting on her stomach, and this time, she wasn't leaving alone. If this already has your heart racing, subscribe right now. You're gonna need it for what comes next. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, seriously. Now, let's get into it. Aisha had never been the kind of woman who begged, not once, not for anyone. 32 years old, and she had learned early that the world does not reward women who collapse, so she had built herself into something solid, something quiet and unbreakable, the kind of woman who feels everything deeply but shows you nothing until she is ready. Tae-Jean Park had loved that about her. Once. She had watched the press conference from his bed, she corrected herself immediately. It had never really been hers. The silk sheets were still warm beside her. Her phone was in her hand. The time in the corner of the screen read 10:14 in the morning. By 10:15, everything was gone. The reporter's question had cut through the carefully managed atmosphere of the room like a blade, sharp, surgical. "Mr. Park, reports suggest a private relationship with an American woman lasting over a year. Confirm or deny?" The room went still. Every camera found his face, and here is the moment that nobody watching would forget. Tae-Jean Park did not flinch. He did not blink. He reached for the microphone, and for exactly half a second, his hand tightened around it, just slightly, just enough that someone paying very close attention might have thought something is off, but the reporters were not paying that kind of attention, and half a second later, it was gone. He looked directly into the camera, and he said 4 words. "I don't know her." Not "we're not together," not "no comment." 4 words. 14 months. Gone. Aisha had read somewhere that the worst pain doesn't scream. It goes quiet. It sits in your chest like a stone and makes everything around you suddenly very still and very sharp at the exact same time. That was what she felt. Not fire, not chaos.
Silence. The specific silence of a woman who has just watched the person she trusted most look into a camera and delete her from his life without blinking. She put her phone down on the nightstand. She stood up. She didn't call him. She didn't cry. She reached for her suitcase. Because here is what Tae-Jean Park did not know. Here is what nobody in that press conference room, nobody watching those cameras, nobody refreshing their feeds could possibly have known. Aisha was pregnant. 11 weeks. She had found out 3 days ago. 3 days of carrying that secret alone, turning it over in her mind, feeling that strange, terrifying mixture of joy and fear, and the desperate need to tell the one person she believed she could trust with something this fragile. She had been planning how to tell him. She had imagined his face softening. She had imagined him reaching for her. Instead, she had watched him erase her on live television, and something inside Aisha, something that had been patient and devoted and quietly hopeful for 14 months, made a decision. Complete, immediate, irreversible. She didn't pack like someone leaving in anger. She packed like someone who already knew she was never coming back. No throwing, no slamming, no chaos. Just quiet, deliberate hands moving through a life she was already letting go of. Her clothes, folded carefully, each piece placed like a full stop at the end of a sentence. The small jewelry box her grandmother had given her, set gently at the top of the suitcase, like something sacred. Her passport, green cover, smooth and cool against her fingers, pressed into her palm like a promise she was making to herself. She left everything he had bought her, every dress, every piece of jewelry, the delicate gold bracelet that had left a faint mark on her wrist from wearing it so often. She wanted nothing from him, nothing that would make her remember him softly on the hard days. Her hand drifted to her stomach, just briefly, just long enough. Whatever this road looked like from here, she was not walking it alone. She zipped the suitcase, picked up her passport, walked to the door, and she didn't look back. Not because she wasn't hurting, but because she had already decided that he would never see it. She was in the elevator when the first real wave hit her. Not grief, something deeper. The specific ache of a woman who had given a man the truest version of herself and watched him return it to the world without flinching.
She thought about the first night he had cooked for her. Tajin Park, the man other men feared, standing at a stove in a plain white shirt, completely unguarded, laughing quietly at himself when he burned the rice. She had thought she was seeing something nobody else got to see, the real version, the one underneath all that power and silence and careful control. Maybe she had been right. Maybe that was exactly the problem. The elevator doors opened. Marble lobby, cool air, a doorman trained to notice nothing. Through the revolving doors, into the sharp morning air. She did not look back. She didn't need to. But here is what Aisha could not have known in that moment. Here is the thing that changes everything about this story. 3 months before that press conference, a woman had disappeared. Her name was Jian. She was 28 years old. She was the girlfriend of Tajin's most trusted lieutenant, a man named Suhan, who had been at his side for 11 years. Jian had nothing to do with their world. She was a florist. She arranged flowers and came home smelling like gardenias, and she loved Suhan with the kind of quiet certainty that makes other people believe in love again. She was taken on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, they found her. Tajin had stood in that room and looked at what had been done to her and made a decision in that moment, cold and complete and devastating in its logic, that no woman connected to him would ever be visible again, not one. He had not told Suhan what he was planning. He had not told anyone. That was how Tajin Park operated. He made decisions in the dark and carried them alone because he believed that was what protection looked like. He had never once considered what it looked like from the other side. And now, at the exact moment Aisha's heels touched the pavement outside, 42 floors above her, Suhan walked into the press conference. 11 years at Tajin's side. 11 years of delivering impossible news with a straight face and a steady voice. Not once in 11 years had he hesitated before speaking. Not once. But this time, he stopped beside Tajin's chair. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the reporters, and he lowered his voice to almost nothing. His hand went to Tajin's shoulder, something he had never done, not once in 11 years, and he whispered 3 words. 3 words that made Tajin Park stand up so fast his chair scraped hard across the floor, that made every camera in the room swing toward him, that made his publicist reach for his arm, and made her shake him off without even seeing her. 3 words that made the most feared man in the city look suddenly like a man who had just run out of time. He pressed his phone to his ear. His jaw was tight, his voice barely a whisper. Where is she? The answer made him close his eyes. She was already gone. But what were those 3 words? And why? Why had Tae-Jin Park really stood at that microphone and deleted the woman he had spent 14 months trying to keep safe from the darkest parts of his world? Because the press conference was not cruelty. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Stay with us, because the truth behind what Tae-Jin Park did is going to change everything you think you know about this story. If you're still here, subscribe right now, because what those 3 words really meant changes everything. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments, are you Team Aisha, or do you think Tae-Jin had a reason? I read every single one. 3 words. That was all it took. 3 words that Soo-han had never said before in 11 years. 3 words that had nothing to do with rivals, nothing to do with business, nothing to do with the kind of threat Tae-Jin Park had spent his entire career calculating and neutralizing before it could breathe. She is pregnant. And for the first time, Tae-Jin Park forgot how to think. The press conference room was still full, camera still rolling, reporters still watching. His publicist was saying something directly into his ear. His security team was already closing in from the edges of the room. He heard none of it. He was already gone. Already 42 floors up, already at her door, already reaching for her. He pressed his phone to his ear and said one word, now. He was moving before the call ended. He walked past his security without answering them, past his publicist who called his name twice and then stopped because something in the way he was moving told her that this was not a moment for management. He ignored 3 calls that would normally take priority over everything. 3 calls from numbers that ran his world.
He didn't even look at the screen. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't calculate. He reacted. The elevator took 31 seconds. He counted without meaning to, an old habit that lived in his body. 31 seconds of standing completely still while everything inside him moved at a speed he had no name for. The doors opened. He already knew before he touched the handle. He knew from the silence. He had lived alone for most of his adult life, and he understood what an empty room felt like from the outside. It has a specific weight, a stillness that is different from a room where someone is simply quiet. He opened the door anyway. The penthouse was exactly as they had left it that morning, except for the things that were missing. Small things, the kind you only notice when you know someone well enough to know what belongs to them. The jewelry box that had lived on the left side of the dresser, the green passport from the nightstand, the worn paperback with the cracked spine, page 200 and something, a folded receipt marking her place. Gone. He looked at the things she had left behind, the dresses, the jewelry, the gold bracelet on the dresser, laid flat and deliberate, not forgotten, placed. She had made a decision with that bracelet. She had set it down with intention. She had walked out of his life and taken nothing from him. Nothing except the one thing he didn't even know she was carrying. He picked up the bracelet. He stood there for a moment. Then he set it back down exactly where she had left it, and he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his head of security. Every exit from the city covered. Private airstrips, train stations. Every option she had. Not to stop her. He was not going to stop her, but he needed to know she was safe. He needed to know that the people who had taken Jian had not followed her out into the city. That was what he told himself. The second call was to Soo-han. How did you find out? Her doctor's office. The appointment was flagged. Your standing order. Monitor everyone connected to you. Tae-Jin said nothing. He had given that order after Jian. After standing in that room and seeing what his world did to the women connected to it. He had given that order to protect people.
He had not thought about what it would eventually mean for someone he actually loved. He ended the call. The third call, he never made. He started to dial her number. Once, twice, 3 times he stopped before the call connected. Because what do you say to a woman you just erased from your life in front of the world? He had faced rivals who wanted him dead. He had sat across tables from men who intended to destroy everything he had built. He had never once been at a loss. With Aisha, he had nothing. He sat on the edge of the bed, still in his press conference suit, the penthouse enormous and silent around him. And he let himself think about her, not strategically, just her. The first night he had cooked for her, standing at the stove in a plain white shirt, completely unguarded, laughing at himself when he burned the rice. She had looked at him like he was something unexpected, something that didn't fit the version of him the world had decided on. She had been right. In a life built entirely on performance and pretense and people who wanted something from him, Aisha had been real. She had walked into the darkest room of his life and somehow made it feel livable. And he had protected that the only way he knew how, in the dark, alone, without telling her. He had watched what they did to Gian, stood in that room, seen the consequence of visibility with his own eyes, and he had made a decision, cold, complete, carrying its own terrible logic, that Aisha would never be a target, never be visible, never be connected to him in any way that could be used against her. He had not considered that from where she was standing, it looked exactly like abandonment. That was his flaw. Not cruelty, something more complicated and in many ways more damaging. He confused protection with control. He made decisions for the people he loved without giving them the truth they needed to understand those decisions. And now she was somewhere in this city, pregnant with his child, believing he looked into a camera and deleted her without feeling a single thing. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. And for the first time in 15 years of calculated moves, he went after her without a plan. No strategy, no script, no prepared words. Just a man moving through a city, looking for the one person who had ever made him feel like more than what he had built himself into. But here's what he didn't know. Aisha was not going to a hotel, not to a friend's apartment, not somewhere temporary that could be undone with an explanation and enough time. Because Aisha had already made a decision about him, about what she was going to do, about whether Tajan Park would ever know that his child existed. She had booked a flight, one way, leaving in 3 hours, and the destination she had chosen was somewhere he would never think to look. If you're still here, you already know this isn't over. Subscribe now because what happens when he finds her changes everything. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments, would you forgive him or walk away? I read every single one. 3 hours. That was all she had. 3 hours before the flight that would take her somewhere he would never find her. Somewhere she could breathe without his world pressing down on her chest. Somewhere she could figure out what it meant to be a mother before first having to figure out what it meant to have loved a man like Tajan Park. She was sitting in the back of a cab, suitcase in the trunk, passport in her hand, the city moving past the window like a film she was no longer part of. She had not cried yet. She kept waiting for it, that moment when the body overrides the mind and the grief arrives whether you want it to or not. But it hadn't come. Instead, there was just that quiet, that terrible, clear-eyed quiet that had settled into her chest the moment she heard those 4 words and hadn't left since. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. 11 weeks. A life that had no idea what it had been born into. a life that deserved better than the story it had been handed before it even arrived. She was going to give it better. That was the decision she had made in the elevator. Simple. Complete.
Tajin Park would not know. Not because she wanted to punish him, though part of her, the part that had watched him erase her on live television, felt the cold clarity of that particular justice, but because she had looked at the life growing inside her and made a promise. This child would never know what it felt like to be denied, would never know what it felt like to be the secret a powerful man kept hidden, would never know what it felt like to be erased. She looked out the window. The city was bright and indifferent and moving fast. 20 minutes from the airport. Tajin found out she had booked a flight in 11 minutes, one-way ticket. He stood on the pavement outside the building and felt something move through him that had no place in the vocabulary of the man he had built himself into. 11 minutes. She had been that ready. She had not hesitated, had not taken time to think it over, had not given him a single window. She had watched that press conference, packed her things, and booked a one-way flight with the efficiency of a woman who had, long before this morning, already prepared herself for the possibility that this day might come. That thought hit him harder than anything else. She had been prepared, which meant some part of her had always known, some part of her had always understood that his world had edges she couldn't see, and that one day she might find herself standing at one of those edges without warning. He had known that too. He just hadn't thought she would move this fast. He hadn't thought she would move at all. And there it was, the assumption buried at the center of everything he had done wrong. He had protected her without consulting her because somewhere underneath all his careful reasoning he had believed, without ever saying it, without ever fully admitting it to himself, that she would stay, that she would be there when he was ready to explain, that his reasons would be enough. He had never once considered that she might not wait for his reasons, that she might look at what he had done and decide, quietly, completely, without drama, that she was worth more than an explanation delivered after the fact. He got into the car. Airport, he said. His hand tightened at his side, not from control.
From the realization that he might already be too late. She was through check-in and moving toward security when she felt it, the specific sensation of being watched. She kept walking. Security line, shoes off, bag through the scanner, everything routine and ordinary and blessedly procedural. She was on the other side. She was almost through, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. His name. She stared at it for a second longer than she intended to. Then she pressed decline, like it meant something final. Because it did. She kept walking. But here is what she didn't know. He wasn't calling from outside the airport. He was already inside. Tajin moved through the airport the way he moved through every space, with a quiet authority that made people step aside without quite knowing why. No running, no urgency visible on the surface. But inside, everything was running. He knew the gate. Suhan had given him everything, flight number, departure time, gate number. He turned the final corner, and for a second, he almost didn't recognize her. She was sitting near the window, still, composed, her suitcase beside her, her passport in her lap, her left hand resting gently on her stomach. She was looking out at the runway with the particular stillness of a woman who has already made peace with a decision. She looked like someone he used to know, someone who had already moved on, and that, more than the empty penthouse, more than the placed bracelet, more than the declined call, was what broke something open in him. He had expected to find her upset. He had expected tears or anger or some version of the grief that matched the size of what had happened between them. Instead, she looked free. His hand tightened at his side. He stepped forward. She looked up. And the moment their eyes met, something shifted in the air between them. Not softness, not relief, something more complicated than either of those things. She looked at him the way you look at someone you have already grieved, already processed, already folded carefully and placed in the part of yourself that keeps things that are finished. Her eyes were clear, steady, completely unafraid. He had prepared for many versions of this moment on the drive over. He had run through scenarios the way he always did, mapping responses, anticipating reactions, finding the angle that gave him the best chance of being heard. Every version he had prepared for involved her being undone. She was not undone. She was composed in a way that made every word he had prepared feel suddenly inadequate. He sat down, 1 seat away, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the wall she had placed between them the moment she looked back at the window. The silence between them was enormous. He broke it the only way he could. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what it looked like." She said nothing. "I need you to know that it wasn't what it looked like." She turned to him then, slowly, and what was in her eyes was not anger. It was something worse, the look of a woman who has already decided. "Don't, Tae-jin, don't. Not here, not now, not after that." She turned back to the window. He sat there, the gate filling around them, announcements overhead, the ordinary machinery of departure moving forward around 2 people sitting completely still at the center of something that was anything but ordinary. He had faced down enemies who wanted him dead. He had sat across from men who intended to destroy everything he had built. He had never once been without words when words were what was needed. With Aisha, he had nothing, because she wasn't giving him anything to work with. No anger to absorb, no tears to respond to, no opening through which he could begin to explain. She had closed every door, and she had done it so quietly and so completely that he hadn't even heard them shut. He had lost access to her. He understood that now with a clarity that felt almost physical, and what made it worse, what made it the specific kind of pain that has no clean remedy, was that she had not closed those doors out of cruelty. She had closed them out of self-preservation. She was protecting herself the way he had always protected her, in the only way she knew how. He sat with that for a moment, let it land fully. Then he said the only thing left that felt true. "I was trying to keep you safe." She was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to respond at all. Then she turned to him one more time. Her hand moved to her stomach, and she said 7 words, quietly, clearly, in a voice that didn't shake even slightly. "You should have let me choose that myself." The gate announcement came overhead. Final boarding call. Aisha stood up. She picked up her suitcase. She picked up her passport. And she looked at him one last time, not with hatred, not with love, but with something in between that was in many ways harder to receive than either. She looked at him like he was a lesson she had already learned, and she walked toward the gate. If you're still here, you already know this story just became something else entirely. Subscribe now, because what happens after she walks through that gate changes everything. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments, are you still Team Aisha or is something shifting? I read every single one. She walked through that gate like a woman who had already buried something, not with grief, not with anger, with the particular quiet dignity of someone who has made a decision so complete that there is nothing left to feel about it except the weight of its finality. Tae-jin sat in that airport seat and watched her go. He did not move. He did not call after her. He did not do any of the things that the part of him that was still calculating, still mapping, still looking for the angle told him he should do. He just sat there. And for the first time in 15 years of building himself into something untouchable, he let himself feel the full weight of what he had lost. The plane took off at 2:17 in the afternoon. Aisha had the window seat. She watched the city shrink beneath her, all that gold and glass and noise becoming something small and manageable from up here, something that could fit in the palm of her hand, something that had no power over her anymore. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her hand on her stomach. She had not looked back at the gate. She had not let herself, because she knew, with the particular self-awareness of a woman who understands her own weak points, that if she had looked back and seen his face, she might have hesitated. And hesitation was the one thing she could not afford. Not for herself, not for this child. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since 10:14 that morning,
she let herself cry. Not the kind of crying that breaks you open and leaves you destroyed, the quieter kind. The kind that comes after a decision has already been made and the body finally catches up with what the mind has been carrying alone. She cried for 14 months of something that had been real. She cried for the man at the stove in the plain white shirt who had laughed at himself and looked at her like she was the most unexpected thing that had ever happened to him. She cried for the version of this story where he had trusted her enough to tell her the truth. And then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, she looked out at the clouds, and she made herself a second promise, quieter than the first, more personal, the kind that lives so deep inside you that it becomes part of how you breathe. She was going to be okay. Not immediately, not without difficulty, but she was going to be okay. Taejin left the airport 40 minutes after her plane took off. He sat in the back of his car and said nothing for a long time. Suhan was in the front seat. He had learned 11 years ago when to speak and when to simply be present. This was a moment for presence. They drove in silence until Taejin said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She said I should have let her choose." Suhan said nothing. She was right. Another silence. I knew she was right the moment she said it. He looked out the window at the city moving past. His city, the one he had built and controlled and protected with 15 years of calculated ruthlessness, the one that had given him everything he had ever decided he wanted. It felt very empty right now. "Find out where she lands," he said finally. Suhan nodded. "And then do nothing. Not this time." Suhan turned slightly. "Sir?" "Find out that she lands safely, that she is somewhere safe, that nobody followed her." He paused. "And then leave her alone." Suhan was quiet for a moment. "And the child?" Taejin closed his eyes. The child. His child.
A life he had not known existed this morning. A life that was now somewhere above the clouds in a plane he could not board, carried by a woman who had looked at him like a lesson she had already learned and walked away without looking back. "She gets to decide," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath the control, anyone paying close enough attention would have heard it, something that sounded very much like grief. She gets to decide everything. 6 weeks later, Aisha was standing in the kitchen of a small apartment she had rented in a city that was quieter and slower and nothing like the place she had left. Morning light coming through the window, coffee on the stove, both hands wrapped around a mug that had been a housewarming gift from the neighbor downstairs, a woman in her 60s who asked no questions and left soup outside her door twice a week without being asked. She was 17 weeks pregnant now, the bump real and visible and hers in a way that felt, on the good days, like the most powerful thing she had ever been part of. She had built something here, small, quiet, entirely her own, a life where no one knew her story, where no one knew his name, where she could walk to the market in the morning and sit by the water in the evening and feel the particular peace of a woman who has survived something and come out the other side with herself intact. She was okay, not every day, but most days, and most days was enough. She was sitting by the window one evening, book in her lap, one hand on her bump, the particular stillness of a woman at peace with where she is, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Silence on the other end. Then a voice. Quiet. Careful. The voice of a man who had spent 6 weeks finding the right words and was still not sure he had them. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back." She said nothing. "I'm not calling to explain myself. You already know everything you need to know." She looked out the window. The water was gold in the evening light. "I'm calling," he said, "because I needed you to hear me say, just once, with no cameras and no room full of people and no calculation behind it, that you were never nobody to me." Her hand moved to her stomach. "You were the only real thing I had." The silence between them was different from the one at the airport. That silence had been a wall. This one was something more complicated. The kind of silence that holds two people who have hurt each other and loved each other and are standing on opposite sides of something that cannot be undone. She closed her eyes. She thought about the man at the stove. She thought about the press conference. She thought about the elevator and the packed suitcase and the promise she had made with one hand on her stomach. She thought about what it meant to forgive someone, not for them, for yourself. She opened her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. And she did. Not forgiveness, not an invitation, but something, the smallest possible opening in a wall that had been built with very good reason. "I know you did," she said. "That's what made it so hard." He was quiet for a long moment. "How are you?" he asked, his voice different now, stripped of everything except the question itself. She looked down at her stomach, at the life that was his and hers and entirely its own. "We're okay," she said. "We." That one word. He heard it. She knew he heard it because of the silence that followed, not empty, not cold, but full of something neither of them was ready to name yet. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." She ended the call. She sat by the window for a long time after, the water outside golden and still, her hand on her stomach, not knowing what came next, not afraid of finding out. Some endings don't close doors. They leave them unlocked. And that is where we leave them tonight. Not with a perfect ending, not with easy forgiveness, but something more honest than either of those things. A woman who chose herself, a man who finally understood what that meant, and a life small and growing and full of possibility that belonged to both of them and neither of them, and most importantly, to itself. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel right now and never miss a story like this. Hit that like button. It helps more people find us, and it keeps these stories coming. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. And tell us, do you think Aisha should give Tae-Jan a chance? Or is she better off building her life on her own terms? We want to know what you think, because every story we tell on this channel starts with you.